Hey, everybody, welcome. Hey, look, we've got a great 2 hours for all of you. The first is we are doing like a whole range of shows on the coronavirus and on COVID-19. And we're bringing to you people that are going to be sharing information. So today it's a two for Benny and Olivia. The first part of the show is with Corey Stern. He'll be joining us. And then the second part, we're bringing Jonathan Bell back. Jonathan Bell is an attorney out of New York. Who came on the show the other day, and he was not kidding when he said to me that he is providing free services. And thanks to him helping me, I made a gigantic discovery in era of my thinking and what I thought was going to happen. And later on, you're going to hear about that. But today, we're going to be tackling aspects of COVID-19. And I'm hoping also we can get Gina back at some point, Gina Rivera, because we are in a place, Benny, right now where, Olivia, Benny, where in the history of the country that I live in, the United States of America, in contrast to our buddies across the what do you call that? We can't call them across the pond, across the border in Canada. We are just learning about, for those of us in business, and so many of you listening are entrepreneurs, self-employed. So today, we're going to give you some information you may not know about, because we've had to back up in the way we're approaching this with our staff. And we've had to back up and change the way that I thought I was approaching this for my business, because every day you learn something new. And I think I must have missed a couple of memos along the way. And what I mean by a couple of memos, I think I must have missed the memo that came out about what PPP was. But more importantly, what we're discovering is we're discovering human nature, human nature. And I'm really struck by imagining what we're capable of during something like this. So I want to go back for a little bit, and I want to talk about what this was like for me to go back before Dr. Pat, when I wore shoulder pads. Benny, you remember the shoulder pad thing?
I
Like,
do remember,
remember that?
not specifically, I remember my sister did.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right.
Yeah.
But what was that
Massive.
movie, Working Girl? Is that what it's called?
Yeah,
Working
and
Girl?
also 9 to 5 too.
9 to
That's another one.
5, Working
Yeah.
Girl, the big shoulders, right? And one of my favorites, oh my gosh, right? George Michael. Oh my God. Like, I still, I go out of my mind thinking about his music. So when you talk to me about the 80s, that's what I think about him, Wham and him. And somebody said Breakfast Club. And I don't know why Breakfast Club I think about, like, even before that. But here's what I do remember being on the New York area. I remember watching my friends die from a disease that folks didn't even know was a disease. And I remember this almost like, I mean, it's shocking. I remember this like it's yesterday, like I had a moment of PTSD, thinking about my hair designer, right? Who had done my hair for a really, really long time. Um, uh, uh, but, uh, yeah, Olivia, bring him in. Let's bring in Corey. But what I'm thinking about this day and age that we went through. I'm also thinking about the courage that all of us experience as we fought for our brothers and sisters and friends and family of a disease that we knew very little about. I went through this again in 2004 here in the state of Washington with a disease that still to this day is not recognized by the world, and that is Lyme disease and Lyme disease co-infections. And if you really want to hear about a disease that's at epidemic proportions, which nobody is talking about, we'll do another show on that. But if we're talking about where we are today, and we're talking about COVID-19, and we're talking about what do I believe, what don't I believe, we want to talk to Corey. He's joining us for the first half hour of the show. And here's the question: can you be sued for infecting someone with the coronavirus? Now, we're going to break this down, but the reason we're going to break this down is because this has so many tentacles that are related to so many other diseases that can be transmitted. But the question is, what nations, if you are under quarantine or your state has given you a shelter in place, but you don't? Corey, it's great to have you. Welcome.
I appreciate the fact that you're still doing this in such a difficult time. Thank you.
I got to tell you, for people like me, Jonathan Bell's going to be popping in the next half hour, because here's what we found out this morning. And this is why having a conversation with you is so important. What we basically found out this morning, what Gina Rivera tried to point out the other day, was that any of us that are contract or employee contract people, we are the lost sheep of this. Found out this morning that if you are a company and you employ contract people, you will not get PPP for them. That every contract person must file for their own PPP, file for their own unemployment. And here we are today with that level of stress. Now compound that with what you're seeing, right? And we now have a scenario that I think is unlike almost anything other. I went through the AIDS epidemic, which is still an epidemic. How do you classify what you're seeing? Because boy, you are right in the middle of it, aren't you?
Yes, ma'am. And I'm old enough where when the AIDS epidemic took place, I was young, but I have vivid memories of it, and I have very vivid memories of post 9/11, which are both comparisons that people have made before I just did.
Mm-hmm.
And this thing is the great equalizer. It's affecting people regardless of age and gender and color and geography and socioeconomic position. And children are having conversations now with their parents about things that most of us probably never expected to have with our kids. And fifth graders don't get to do their elementary graduation, and high school seniors don't have a prom. And those things pale in comparison to people who have loved ones that are on ventilators for days or weeks and who ultimately die. And so this has sort of been the microscope on our society and showing us things about ourselves, not just as a legal community or as a society, but globally, just
Mm-hmm.
how are we functioning, and how do we relate to each other, and how do you show love, and how do you show patience in times of crises like this that have no real end in sight?
Boy, you just nailed it. You just nailed it. And, the reason I wanted you on here, and we're doing shorter segments so that we can bring you back, Corey. We plan to do entire full channel series of segments, because when I first started out with this, Corey, and I said, we're going to have our own segment and channel, I had no idea. I had no idea what needed to be talked about. I want to ask you this question. Given where you sit today, what is at the top of your list that concerns you most?
So, that there's a multifaceted answer to a really great question. I mean, first and foremost, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a friend, I'm a child. I'm also a lawyer and I have clients that I represent. And so my concerns are different in each of those areas. As a lawyer, I'm most concerned that most of the people who I represent are victims of sexual abuse or children who are brain damaged from lead poisoning. And it's not justice for them is not gratuitous. It's a matter of their ability to heal and feed themselves and find economic function in a space where they've sometimes been unable to function economically. And so how do we utilize this time where courts are either closed or slowing or slowed down? How do we productively utilize this time to still advocate for them when that advocacy isn't necessarily being heard by people who need to hear it, because the crisis is so much larger than any one individual's potential lawsuit or claim. As a parent, I want my kids to not feel my fear, but I want them to understand that it exists in a way that's healthy. And my wife and I try to talk to our children about, those clients of mine that I just mentioned and what they're experiencing through this, and how everyone's life is so different, but affected in a really meaningful way by what's happening. And I also try to give a little bit of hope to my kids where, we live in a world where the environment is a big issue, and our carbon footprint matters. And at least what the science says is that we're doing things that are really harmful to our environment. And I look at the last month, the last 5-6 weeks, and I think of what a wonderful moment it has been for the environment, because we've pretty much shut down in ways we've never have before. And so the air is cleaner and people are breathing better. And there's also, the fear that when we go back to some sense of normal, some of the wonderful things that have come out of this, like family dinners and telling people you love them more, and really taking stock in what's important versus what you thought was important. I don't want to see those things go away. You asked earlier, you mentioned the AIDS epidemic, and I mentioned 9/11. It's amazing how much has changed, but at the same time, how things have gone back in many ways to pre 9/11. People are not on a daily basis conscious of, terrorism and domestic terrorism. And, I very rarely think when I get on an airplane or walk through an airport about 9/11, but for years after it actually happened, it was always at the front of my mind. And so as a lawyer, as a dad, as a husband, as a human being, I want to acknowledge what's happening and allow it to bring some good to my life and to the lives of the people that I love. But that's a really aspirational statement, and it's not as easy every day when you watch the news and you have family that's sick, and it's it's not as easy as I just made it sound.
Well, look, I know this is a short interview and you will be coming back, but I want to talk about something that is really near and dear to my heart in a lot of ways. I saw this happen in the AIDS epidemic, then I saw it with Lyme disease, and that is, how we conduct each other, how we conduct ourselves with each other. If you have a disease, for example, that can be contracted by another person, and you are not mindful of that and pass that disease on, we have seen time over time really implications for what rights an individual has. And I know you've been first chair in some of the most important cases for children in lead poisoning, and so is your firm. But are we in the state now where people that are not paying attention to what they're being asked to do could, in fact, be liable for injuries that may happen to another?
So the easy answer is yes, people
Yeah.
can be liable.
Yeah,
I
that is
mean,
the easy
you
answer.
know, whether attorneys actually pursue cases like that. I mean, I guess it depends on who the person is that's not being mindful. if a tree falls on a car and destroys the car and everybody that's in the car becomes paralyzed, you might have a great potential lawsuit against the tree, but a tree doesn't have insurance and a tree doesn't have money. And lawsuits that are based on principle rather than, some economic benefit to the harmed, they aren't really lawsuits that most lawyers would typically take. So I think more likely what I think we will start seeing is in the criminal context. Anybody that would have in the 80s gone out and known they were HIV positive or had full-blown AIDS and had infected someone purposefully, I mean, they could have, and in some instances were charged with crimes.
Yep.
And I think that, I was on a subway in Manhattan in maybe early March or mid-March when sort of the coronavirus began having some legs, and I coughed. I remember having a little bit of a cough, and there was a woman across from me who looked at me as if I was her fear. And my first reaction was, what the heck? I'm healthy. Why are you looking at me like that? I didn't say that. But as I thought about it, I thought to myself, my God, if I'm coughing, I probably shouldn't be on the subway. Like what, I mean, and so I think that the legal system provides both a civil remedy in the situation that you described where someone infects someone either intentionally or negligently. The criminal codes that we have across this country in each state provide for criminal liability for potentially infecting people. But I think like every other type of case that I handle, whether it's a kid who was brain damaged because their landlord didn't properly abate a premises, or a child who was sexually abused because a school didn't properly train or vet their teachers, and so the kid was sexually abused, we have a personal responsibility to each other. And, people shouldn't always have to rely on the law to protect them. I knew better in that moment that if I was going to cough for another day or for another hour, for another minute, even if I knew I wasn't sick, that even for that poor woman's state of mind, knowing that she was a little older and maybe more susceptible to COVID, I have a responsibility to my neighbors, to my friends, to strangers, to do my part to make sure they don't get sick. So I think there will be civil cases that are filed. I think there will be criminal cases that come to light as a result of this. But I hope there aren't. I hope that we all just do the right thing and do our best to care for each other.
Well, it's interesting we're talking about this because, I'm going to have Jonathan Bell on. He's well, gosh, I don't like to classify you folks that are out there representing people, as attorneys, but, his area is employment, right? Labor law.
Yep.
So he's going to come on and talk about that. But one of the things that hit me in my conversation with him this morning, which was shocking, and that is, as an employer, you try to do the best you can to keep people on as long as you can. But the guidelines around that are coming out of Washington around employment and contract people are so horrific that even somebody like me, if all in good intention, I try to establish something that will keep my folks in the loop so they clearly will have jobs, I might not be able to do that. I might run the risk of getting sued. And I'm just thinking to myself, I don't know who the people are that are making up these guidelines. I mean, if you—
And I'm not sure. Yeah. I'm not sure the people making the guidelines even understand the guidelines that they're making.
I don't think they do, because on the one hand, they're trying to say, yeah, we want you to hire your people back. On the other hand, if you give people any work at all, as a matter of fact, I found out this morning that we either have to furlough people 100%, let them go, take away their emails because they can't have not one single contact with the company. I mean, think about this. Or we can significantly reduce their time. Now, for us, we know that the best scenario is to bring people to part-time so they can do two things. One, they could apply for their own PPP. They may even be eligible to unemployment. And at the same time, I don't have to wipe them from the face of my company as if they didn't exist. I mean, and you know what I'm on top of this more than others, but I found out this morning I'm not going to get any PPP relief for any of my 1099 people. So here we are. What are we, like 8 weeks into this? I'm not sure. How long? About 8 weeks?
I mean, some people in Iowa think it's been like a week, and people in Manhattan think it's been about 12.
And I'm in
But it's
Washington
probably
State.
8. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, to your point, I mean, I have a very close friend in Brooklyn who owns two different types of food service industries. One is a place where they've, for 15 years, sold cheese and wine and kind of those kinds of things. And the other is a straight up, wine store.
Yeah.
And, he had to close one of his stores because he had to make the choice that you're describing. And the choice was, it turned out that the most economically feasible option was just to shut the whole thing down. And after 15 years, close his business. And that gave his employees the ability to file for unemployment. There was no like mid-ground option for them. And I guess the hardest part for, a law firm is a business, a cheese store is a business, a radio station and a podcast can be businesses. We are trying to balance, all of us who own and run businesses, the need for our families broadly, including our employees and the people we work with on a daily basis and have real affection and love for, with the needs of our families in the micro, which is our wives and our husbands and our kids and our putting food on the table. And these are decisions that 12 weeks ago, no matter where you live, no one was considering. I mean, nobody considered that the economy would shut down, that stores would have to close, that you would have to make decisions versus furloughs versus complete layoffs. The acronyms PPP, these are things that weren't in our conscience. We're talking a different language today than we were 12 weeks ago. And one of the beautiful things about it is it's where you find sort of the best in people and also the worst in people. But I every night get online to look at all the different places in New York City where people at 7 p.m. are hanging out their windows, banging on pots and pans and clapping and hooting and hollering for all the first responders and all the folks, because it gives me that same sense. And I'm a flaming liberal, but when George Bush went to ground zero after 9/11, I remember getting a knot in my stomach and a lump in my throat and tearing up because of the fellowship I felt with so many strangers and with him in that moment. And so a lot of good will come of this. And it's just a shame that we're still in that part of the tunnel where there doesn't seem to be a light. And I think as Americans and as a society, we need to be really careful and skeptical of the fringe individuals who try and tell us there's a light when no one else can really see it. Because in times like this, we'll cling to any type of positivity and hope that we can, even if it's not supported by science. And, I'd rather dig in and be in it for the long haul and know it and do the right thing than to try and sprint toward a finish line that doesn't really exist.
Yeah. And I think what you're pointing to, and I know we got about 3 minutes left, but I'll tell you what you're pointing to that is really hung heavy on my mind and my colleagues' minds and my attorney's mind. And that is the government agencies that have dangled out a return to work and a heightened economy by a certain date. And I've watched that. And, what happens with that is people don't go to the extraordinary length of seeking out loans and seeking out help because they're under the guise it's going to be over by May 1st. I mean, I was talking to a colleague of mine who basically heard a newscast by my governor talking about a May 5th date. And so he's like, well, wait a minute, I can hang on to that. I don't need to file. And I'm just thinking, wow, why would we put a date like that out to people knowing what we know and not give them the opportunity to take these actions that could literally provide them a lifeline? That to me is the immoral aspect of what I'm seeing. Does that make sense?
I agree with you. And it's certainly one of the immoral aspects. I mean, we sometimes when you dangle hope to folks, they lose sight of all the other things around them, and they're just focused on the thing being dangled. And this is a life and death situation, both in reality as well as metaphorically, for people's livelihoods. And there's never been a time where people needed to be more aware of everything that's around them, 360 degrees, both physically as well as what's available to them from the government and what their responsibilities are to take advantage of those things. And when you shine a bright, bright light a little bit in the distance, it takes people's attention away from all the things around them that they need to focus on. And that's both a metaphor and the reality of our situation right now. So, you know, people like you talking about it, and, you know, folks who are trying to balance empathy, compassion, and intelligence with how do I survive and how do I help the people I love and my neighbors survive. I think that ultimately most of us are good, and people are good regardless of their party and affiliation and financial situation. And I think that the goodness in everybody is really coming out, and we'll all get through this. But everyone from the top down needs to just remember that we really are all in this together. And you know, and honesty is gonna lead people far better, and people will be more appreciative in the long run of the truth, no matter how hard it might be to taste, versus false hope, which ultimately angers people when the false part of it comes to light.
Yeah, no kidding. I studied the consequences of broken promises 10 years. I wrote a body of research that won awards on psychological contract violation. And what you just talked about is the number one leading cause of mistrust, what you just talked about. Corey, can you please tell folks how they can find out more about you? And thank you for today. We will be having you back.
Well, I'm so honored to have spent time with you. And to the extent anybody's so bored that they'd want to find me after hearing me talk for a few minutes, I
want to hear you talk more.
my law firm's website is levylaw.com, levylaw.com, and I'm on Twitter at CMS1000. And you could also just Google search me, Corey Stern, CoreYStern. And anybody that's got a child that's ever been hurt, A, I'm sorry, and B, I've spent my professional career trying to take care of those people. So I'd love to help if I ever can. And if I can't, I'm always happy to send people to someone who I think could.
All right. I love it, Corey, and I hope you will come back. We're going to take a short break. This is our COVID-19 update. We are taking your comments and your questions. 1-800-930-2819. We'll be right back.